She covered the orchard. She ran the heaters. She checked the forecast twice. It didn't matter. On the morning of May 9th, 1983, the temperature at Diane Kepler's farm in Delaware County, Iowa dropped to 24 degrees Fahrenheit. The forecast had called for a low of 31. The National Weather Service station in Dubuque had issued a frost advisory, not a freeze warning. Frost advisory meant the risk was real, but the damage would be limited. Tender plants, early vegetables, the kind of thing that set you back a week but didn't end a season. 24 degrees was not a frost advisory situation. 24 degrees, held for 3 hours between 2 and 5 in the morning, was a hard freeze, and a hard freeze in the second week of May, when an apple orchard was at full bloom, was something different from a setback. It was a destruction event. Diane knew this before she walked the first row. She had been up since midnight. She had started the propane heaters at 11 the night before, when the temperature dropped faster than the forecast had suggested it would. She had checked the thermometers she kept on poles at 3 points in the orchard: north end, center, south end near the windbreak. At midnight. At 1, at 2:30. At 2:30, the north thermometer read 26. The center read 25. The south, which usually ran warmer because the windbreak held some heat, read 27. She had gone back inside and called the NWS recorded forecast line. The update had come in at 1 in the morning. Low of 28, revised from 31. Still not a freeze warning. She had stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the heaters running outside, and made the calculation that every orchard grower makes in that situation. The equipment was running, the covers were on the most vulnerable blocks. There was nothing more to do that the system wasn't already doing. She went to bed at 3. At 5:15, when she walked out to check, the north thermometer read 24. Diane Kepler was 41 years old, in the spring of 1983. She had grown apples on 28 acres in Delaware County for 11 years, having taken over the operation from her parents in 1972, when her father's health made it impossible for him to continue. She was not the only woman running an orchard in eastern Iowa, but she was one of a small number, and she had spent the first several years of her tenure managing the additional scrutiny that came with that, from the bank that held her operating line, from the input suppliers who addressed their correspondence to Mr. Kepler until she corrected them, from the occasional buyer who seemed surprised to find her at the end of a conversation they had expected to have with someone else. By 1983, the scrutiny had largely faded, replaced by a track record that spoke more clearly than any of it had. 11 years of operations, a diversified variety mix that spread her harvest from late August through October, a U-pick operation that she had built from nothing in 1977, which now accounted for approximately 35% of her gross revenue and insulated her from the wholesale price volatility that troubled growers who sold entirely to processors and grocery distributors. Eastern Iowa is not the first place most people think of when they think of apple country. The Midwest apple industry in the early 1980s existed largely in the shadow of the large commercial operations in Washington State and New York, which dominated the wholesale and retail markets through scale that Iowa growers could not approach. What Iowa orchards had was proximity to local grocery buyers, to farm market customers, to the kind of direct sale relationships that the large shippers could not service economically at short distances. Diane had understood this from her first year. She had not tried to compete with Washington State Jonathan apples at the wholesale level. She had sold her Jonathan apples to the people who drove to her farm to pick them, who returned every October, who knew her by name and whom she knew by name, and who paid her a retail price per bushel that was roughly twice what a wholesale buyer would have offered. The U-pick model had lower volume and higher labor intensity, but it had margins that a direct sale orchard could actually survive on. She had built the frost protection system herself, or rather, she had designed it and contracted the installation in 1979 after a late frost in 1978, had taken 40% of her crop and left her with a season that had barely covered operating costs. The system consisted of 12 propane heaters, positioned through the orchard according to a pattern she had worked out with an extension specialist from Iowa State. 3 overhead irrigation risers that could run water over the canopy in ice nucleation conditions, and the 3 thermometers on poles that she checked obsessively from April 15th through May 20th every year. She had invested $14,000 in the system over 2 installations. She had financed $9,000 of that through an operating loan that she had paid off by 1982. The system had worked well in 1980, saving an estimated 60% of what would otherwise have been a total loss in a late April event. It had worked adequately in 1981, a year with no significant frost events. In 1982, she had not needed it at all. In May of 1983, she needed it to hold a temperature that it was not designed to hold. And that's the part of this that's hard to shake. She didn't cut corners. She didn't miss anything. The system was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. But there's a point where your preparation ends, and the weather just takes over. That night, it went 3 degrees past anything a reasonable setup was built to handle. You can plan for what's likely. You can't always plan for what's just barely possible. That's not a mistake. That's just the edge of what anybody can do. The design specification for the system, as the extension specialist had explained it in 1979, was protection to approximately 27 degrees Fahrenheit for a duration of 4 hours or less. Below that threshold, or above that duration, the heat output from the propane heaters and the latent heat release from the irrigation water would be insufficient to prevent tissue damage in bloom stage apple flowers. The specification was not a failure of the system. It was a statement of physical limits. A propane heater produces a fixed BTU output. It warms the air within a certain radius. It cannot warm air that is moving faster than the heat can diffuse, and it cannot compensate for a temperature differential that exceeds the design envelope. On the night of May 8th into May 9th, 1983, the temperature in Delaware County dropped to 24 degrees, 3 degrees below the system's design threshold, and held there for 3 hours. The heaters ran. The irrigation ran on 2 of the 3 riser positions, the third having developed a pressure issue the previous fall that Diane had scheduled for repair in June, before frost season, which was when she had expected to need it. The repair had been scheduled for June because no one schedules frost protection repairs in June expecting to need the system in May. She had done everything the system required. She had started the heaters at the right time. She had checked the thermometers at the right intervals. She had run the irrigation on the 2 functional risers. She had made the right decisions given the information available to her at every point in the night. The temperature went to 24 anyway. Apple flowers at full bloom are damaged at temperatures below 27 degrees Fahrenheit. The critical tissue is the pistil, the reproductive structure at the center of the flower that, if it survives, becomes the apple. At 28 degrees, some pistil damage occurs. The threshold for 10% kill is approximately 28.5 degrees. At 24 degrees, held for 3 hours, the kill rate for open blooms approaches 90%. Diane walked the orchard at first light on May 9th with a hand lens and a pocket knife. She did not need either of them to know what she was looking at. The blooms that had been white and fully open the afternoon before were brown at the center. The pistil had frozen and died. She cut open flowers on 12 different trees across 4 varieties. In the Jonathan block, which was her primary commercial variety, the damage was complete. Every flower she opened showed a blackened pistil. She did the same assessment in the Cortland block, the Golden Delicious block, and the early ripening Lodi block she had planted in 1980 as an experiment in variety diversification. The Lodi block showed approximately 40% survival. The flowers in this block had been slightly less advanced, perhaps 2 days behind the others in phenological stage, which meant the pistil tissue had been marginally less exposed. 40% was not good. It was the best number she had. She walked back to the house and sat at the table and wrote down what she had seen. Jonathan, 0%. Cortland, 5%. Golden Delicious, 10%. Lodi, 40%. Weighted by acreage, the orchard's surviving crop potential was approximately 28% of a normal year. She crossed that out and wrote 25%, which she considered more realistic given what she knew about how the surviving Lodi flowers would set and thin. She stared at the number for a while, then she called her insurance agent. Diane had carried crop insurance on the orchard since 1979, the same year she had installed the frost protection system. The two decisions had been connected. The bank that financed the system had required documented insurance coverage as a condition of the loan, and she had maintained the coverage after the loan was paid off because the math continued to make sense. Her policy covered loss exceeding 25% of her established yield history, calculated from the previous 5 years' production records. Her established yield was 4,200 bushels. A 25% loss meant anything below 3,150 bushels triggered the policy. She was looking at a year of somewhere between 900 and 1,100 bushels. A loss of approximately 75% from her established yield, or 3,100 bushels below her coverage threshold. The indemnity calculation was not simple, and she did not attempt it on the phone. She told her agent what she had seen. She said she wanted to file a claim. She said she needed an adjuster on the property as soon as possible because the evidence was in the bloom damage, and that evidence would not last. By next week, the dead flowers would fall, and the damage would be harder to document at the flower level. The adjuster came out on May 12th. He walked the orchard with Diane for 2 hours, cutting flowers, taking notes, photographing the damage at each varietal block. He confirmed her assessment within a narrow margin. His estimate was 27% surviving crop potential across the full orchard, weighted by acreage. He called it one of the more complete frost events he had assessed in 15 years of doing this work in eastern Iowa. He said the claim would be processed and she should receive an initial determination within 60 days. She thanked him and walked him to his car. The summer of 1983 on Diane Kepler's farm was the work of managing a season that had already been decided. The surviving Lodi crop came in at 380 bushels in August, below even her most pessimistic estimate, because a dry July had reduced fruit size in the already stressed trees. The Jonathan and Cortland blocks produced almost nothing. She harvested 140 bushels of culls, and drops that were suitable only for cider pressing, which she sold to a local cidery at $4.20 per bushel. She ran the U-pick operation through September and October, but without the Jonathan and Cortland blocks, which together represented 60% of her U-pick acreage, the traffic was limited. She had regulars who came every year for the Jonathan variety specifically, and several of them drove out anyway and walked the empty rows and bought what Lodi she had left and told her they would be back next year. She appreciated that. She wrote down their names. Her gross revenue for 1983 was $14,200. In a normal year, it ran between $67,000 and $74,000. What the summer required of her, practically, was a kind of management that does not appear in agricultural success stories. The management of doing less, of not spending money that would not return anything in this season, of deferring maintenance that was not critical, reducing variable inputs that had no crop to support, keeping the fixed cost structure intact while cutting everything that moved with volume. She did not hire the seasonal help she normally brought on for harvest. She did not run the roadside stand beyond 3 days a week because there was not enough product to justify 5. She did not exhibit at the county farm market in October, which had been a consistent revenue source for 4 years. because the cost of the booth and the transport would not have been recovered by what she had to sell. She applied for a disaster operating loan through the Farmers Home Administration, the same agency that was processing thousands of such requests across Iowa that year for grain farmers, livestock operations, and every category of agricultural producer that the 1983 season had damaged in one way or another. She was approved for $18,000 at a subsidized interest rate. She did not draw the full amount. She drew $11,000, which covered the gap between her reduced revenue and her fixed obligations through the end of the year. The remaining $7,000 she left in the facility, available if she needed it but not drawn against. Her insurance agent had told her to draw the maximum. The banker had told her to draw the maximum. She had drawn what she needed and not what was available because she had always operated that way, and a bad year was not a reason to change it. That part gets me every time. The banker told her, take the maximum. The insurance agent told her, take the maximum. And she took what she needed and left the rest on the table. In the worst year of her life on that farm, she still wouldn't borrow money she didn't have a plan for. That's not stubbornness. That's the same discipline that kept that farm running in the good years too. And when everything was falling apart around her, that part of her didn't change at all. The insurance indemnity came through in August, $31,400. The calculation had taken longer than the adjuster's initial estimate because the FCIC adjuster and the local adjuster had needed to reconcile their yield history records, and there had been a dispute about the established yield figure that her agent had resolved by submitting 4 additional years of production records going back to 1974. The final number was $31,400, paid in 2 installments, the second arriving in October. With the insurance payment and the reduced crop revenue, her total income for 1983 was $45,600. Her fixed costs, the land note, the equipment loans, the insurance premium itself, property taxes, came to $28,400. Her variable costs for the season, which had run lower than usual because there was less crop to tend, came to $11,200. Total costs, $39,600. Net, $6,000. $6,000 on a year in which she had lost 75% of her crop. She was not comfortable. She was solvent. In the fall of 1983, Diane made 3 decisions that reflected the season she had just come through without making more of it than it was. The first was the repair of the 3rd irrigation riser, which she had scheduled for June and which had in fact been repaired in June, on schedule, before she fully understood how much it might have mattered in May. She did not know whether the 3rd riser would have changed the outcome. The temperature had been 3 degrees below the system's design threshold. A 3rd riser might have added 1 degree of protection. It would not have added 3. She repaired it anyway, because it needed to be repaired, and because the season had reminded her that equipment that was supposed to be functional needed to actually be functional. She also had the extension specialist back out in the fall to review the heater placement. Not because she thought the placement had been wrong, but because she wanted a second set of eyes on the system after a failure event. The same way you have a mechanic look at a car after an accident, even when you know what caused it. The specialist looked at everything and said the system was correctly configured. He said the May 9th event had been outside the design parameters, and there was no reconfiguration that would have changed that outcome without a fundamentally different system. Larger heaters, closer spacing, or a wine machine installation that would have required $40,000 she did not have and could not have justified on the probability of a 24-degree May freeze. She thanked him for coming and did not reconfigure the system. The second decision was replanting. She ordered 140 Jonathan trees from a nursery in Michigan, which was the maximum she could plant and tend without additional labor. The trees would take 4 years to come into bearing production. She would not have a full Jonathan crop again until 1987 at the earliest. The 4 years between planting and production were 4 years of paying the land note on acreage that was producing nothing. She had calculated this before ordering. She had ordered anyway, because the alternative was not replanting. And not replanting meant the farm's production capacity would permanently contract by 60% of its U-pick acreage. She ordered them in October, and they arrived the following April, and she planted them herself over 3 weekends with help from her neighbor's son, who was 17 and worked for $3.50 an hour and did not ask questions about the year she had just had. The third decision was smaller and more personal. She had kept, since 1972, a production log, a bound ledger in which she recorded, for every season, the yield by variety, the gross revenue, the operating costs, and a brief narrative of the growing conditions. The entry for 1983 was the shortest she had written. It recorded the frost date, the temperature, the yield numbers, the insurance outcome, and the replanting decision. At the bottom of the entry she wrote, "Season lost to frost. System performed within design limits. Design limits were insufficient. Replanting underway. No structural changes to operation required." She closed the ledger and put it back on the shelf. Iowa, in 1983, was a state absorbing losses from multiple directions simultaneously. The grain farmers were in the third year of the farm debt crisis. The livestock operations were managing feed cost increases that had compressed their margins since 1980. And scattered across the eastern counties, the fruit and vegetable growers, who had built small, diversified operations over the previous decade, were absorbing a frost event that had hit their orchards and strawberry fields and asparagus beds in the same May window that had hurt Diane's apples. None of this appeared in the national agricultural news, which was focused on the scale of the grain crisis, the foreclosures in Nebraska and Iowa and Kansas, the farm aid conversations beginning to take shape, the policy debates in Washington about what the federal government could or should do for farmers who had borrowed at high interest rates against land values that had since collapsed. An apple grower in Delaware County losing 75% of her crop to a late frost was not that story. It was a different kind of loss, sharper in the immediate season, less existential in the structural sense, more recoverable in the long run if the operation's foundations were solid. Diane's foundations were solid, not because she had been lucky or because the frost had been merciful. It had not been. But because the decisions she had made in 1977 and 1979 and every year since, the U-pick model, the insurance, the frost protection system, the discipline of not drawing more credit than she needed, had built an operation that could absorb a total loss in one season and still be there the following spring. Diane's orchard recovered, not quickly and not completely in the way it had existed before 1983. The replanted Jonathan block did not reach full production until 1988, and the variety mix she managed in the intervening years was different from what she had built over the previous decade. But the farm was still there. The U-pick customers came back. The insurance had done what insurance is supposed to do. The frost of May 9th, 1983, had not been survivable because Diane had done something heroic or found a solution that others had missed. It had been survivable because of decisions made in 1979. The insurance policy, the frost protection system, the operating discipline that kept her fixed costs low enough that a $6,000 net year did not require selling the farm. She had done everything right in the spring of 1983. The frost came anyway. The farm is still there because of what she had done right in the years before the frost came, not because of anything she did the night it arrived. That is a different kind of story than the ones that get told about farming. It does not have a twist. It does not have a moment where the right decision changes everything. It has a woman who walked her orchard at first light on May 9th and saw what there was to see and wrote down the number and called her insurance agent. 1 year lost. The orchard is still producing.